So we're going on with your United States history, and we're in chapter 3 now. And this chapter is going to talk about the life in colonial America between 1607 and 1775, before America was a nation, before America was independent. How did people live then? We're going to talk about it as a land of diversity, lots of different kinds of people coming to America. The livelihood of the colonies, how they lived, what they ate, how they built their buildings and all these things. And then we're going to talk about their education. What did they think about education? How did they educate themselves? So let's begin. Settlers came from everywhere. Diversity, right? Settlers came to America from all over Europe. They came and they fought the natives, they cleared the land, they planted the crops, and they established their homes. Life was very rugged and uncertain in America. And there was a prospect, though, of new freedom. They all believed that they were free, and most came because of economic freedom or mainly religious freedom to worship as they saw, to worship, have faith freely. So the prospect of new freedom gave them opportunity. Then this freedom inspired them and challenged them and gave them perseverance to keep going. That was their faith and their freedom. So in 1763, they became uniquely American. America was becoming a nation different from England. They would have the Protestant work ethic. Remember the Puritan work ethic? The Protestant work ethic was hard work, personal responsibility, high morals, and integrity. That would be America, and settlers came from everywhere. The land of diversity, as you see there, and you see it there, all the different, we have French, Swedish, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, African, Scots-Irish, and Dutch, German, and English. The Scots-Irish were a combination in North Africa at that time. So English, of course, was the largest amount. We have 39% from England. And then next was the Scots-Irish they immigrated to North Ireland in the 1600s, and they settled mainly in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, so. Although German and Dutch had quite a bit too, we see there. The Dutch, we see 18% in this one. So they were escaping, the Germans were escaping religious persecution. And the Dutch came, remember we had New Netherlands. Basically New York was mainly Dutch in the beginning, right? And so the Germans settled mainly in Pennsylvania, as we see. And then of course we have the Africans that came with the slave trade. And the Africans came, and also we have the Native Americans mixed in there too. You see that map there, you can see coming from England here and, to the West Indies where people migrated from England there, but you can see the land of diversity forming in America. Of course, they had a variety of churches, right? We know that. In New England, well, we know the Pilgrims came to New England and the Puritans came to New England. Massachusetts, Puritan, very Puritan, and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island all had a Puritan base, although Rhode Island had such religious freedom as actually the state that had the most religious freedom, and so many faiths came to Rhode Island, especially Baptists came to Rhode Island. And then we have the Puritan Congregationalists that came to Massachusetts and up into New Hampshire, because New Hampshire was pretty much colonized by people from Massachusetts. And the Puritans, the thing about the Puritans is they paid taxes for their churches. So their church and their states were not separate entities. So, so they would pay taxes so that they could support the church. And you would call a Puritan church a congregational church, right? That's a name for it. That was New England. And on to the middle colonies. We have the middle colonies being New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Well, there was very much religious diversity in all of those colonies. Sometimes I call them states, because they became states later on, but at this time they were colonies. There was religious diversity, and at that point they had a lot of Presbyterians, Baptists, Anglicans, Mennonites, Dutch Reformed, Quakers, and even Jewish people came to these areas. And then in Pennsylvania, though, we have a lot of Amish, Moravian, and Quakers there, because William Penn, of course, was a Quaker, right? Those were the middle colonies. Now on to the southern colonies. We have Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Those are in the south, Georgia being the southernmost there, although kind of next to the Carolinas. So we have Anglican, the Church of England founded a lot of these colonies because remember they were proprietary colonies, which meant they were given as gifts to men from the King of England. And so a lot of these would be the Church of England, right? Although Maryland was supposed to be founded by Catholics, although 200 Catholics came to colonize Maryland, but that's about all. Because then Maryland opened up the freedom for anyone to come, and religious diversity came, and so a lot of different faiths came. So Catholics are not the main faith in Maryland, even though it was founded for that purpose. And later, Baptists and Presbyterians, of course, came to Maryland. And in North Carolina, we had a Baha'i Moravian Christians. They were coming, and also French Huguenots. They were coming because of persecution in France and in Europe, and so they were finding a place that they could live and that they could worship freely, right? Social classes. What kind of social classes? Well, nationality and social class and faith. When they got out to the frontier, they didn't make much a difference, did they? So when you got on the frontier, you were working and you were trying to stay alive, right? And so people didn't look at your social class. They didn't look at where you were born or what nationality you were so much. And they kind of ignored even what faith you are, basically working together. So social classes, they did later on have social class, maybe not on the frontier. We have the aristocracy, which is the aristocrat people would be the businessmen, professionals, plantation owners that were wealthy, and they were noted for their wealth. They weren't noted for their noble bloodlines. Like if you said, well, I'm of the royal line, they could care less, right? So they weren't really noted for their nationalities, but that they were wealthy. That's how the aristocrats were in America. And England, not. You always, of course, the aristocrats were mainly the kings and the queens and the royals, and and your bloodline was important, but not in America. The middle class in America, they were the small shop owners and the craftsmen and the farmers. They were the middle class, and the middle class started growing in America. And they weren't wealthy, but they were self-sufficient. They could take care of themselves. And then, of course, towards the lower classes would be the indentured servants and slaves. The indentured servants was someone that a person in America or in Europe would pay for their way to come to America, and they'd have 7 years to pay them back. And so they would work as servants for 7 years, and then they'd be free. Those were indentured servants. Slaves, they were just owned, at that time. So in Europe, social class, of course, was based on birth, and it was difficult to escape. So if you were in Europe and were poor, and you were a poor peasant, your kids would be poor peasants, and your grandkids would probably be poor peasants. You had little ways to escape out of poverty, right? And even the wealthy had little. If you had royal bloodline, you were on royalty no matter what. So that's what's going on in Europe, but not in America. People came to America, it was your willingness to work. And it was based on, it would be based too on wealth, but basically in America, people looked at how hardworking you were. except for slaves. Slaves still in America, especially the slaves that came from Africa, had little way of out at this time of slavery. But, of course, America would be called the land of opportunity. The livelihood of the colonies. Well, you needed great integrity to survive in America because you would have limited weapons. You didn't have a lot of weapons. You didn't have a lot of tools or materials to build with. You had to use what you had here in America. You had to adapt at many different skills and many different trades. But 90% of the people that came ended up being farmers. And every single family usually had a small farm so that they could raise food for their family, so they could be self-sufficient. In New England, of course, we know that's, Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Connecticut, that area. They were long winters, especially in New England, Plymouth, around Massachusetts. Very rugged ground and very short seasons to grow things because it was cold. And but they still grew a lot of different crops, especially corn in those areas in New England. So they had to get through those rough winters. In the middle colonies, the middle colonies, when you think of the colonies out of New York, well, actually, I think it's New York and Connecticut and, those colonies in the middle, Pennsylvania. So they had fertile soil and a moderate climate, and so they were called the bread colonies because they had abundance of bread grains like wheat, corn, barley, oats, fruit and vegetables, and livestock. So they had a lot of different resources in the middle colonies just because of their moderate climate and their fertile soil. And they even exported food, even to the West Indies. So those are the middle fertile soil, the bread colonies. And then we had, of course, the southern colonies who did have fertile soil and a very warm, humid climate and very long growing seasons. And this is where the plantations happened. One of the biggest plantations was of tobacco plantations, because tobacco plantation made them a lot of money to export because people in Europe wanted tobacco. It was started with the Native Americans, but it turned into a big exporting, and a big way to make money is to have a tobacco plantation. Also in South Carolina, they exported indigo dye, a dye that a lot of people had, a kind of a bluish dark dye that you dye clothes. And that was a big export of indigo. Of course, they'd be able to raise rice because rice likes that warm climate, and fruit and vegetables too. So, so we have these livelihoods depending on what they would eat and what they would export in some ways. This is the 13 colonies. Let's back up here a little bit there. And you see the New England settled to practice the religious freedom. They had lumber, shipbuilding, international trade. Culture was small towns and usually small families in New England area. Massachusetts, was kind of the center of that. The middle colonies, there, you see the green are our New England colonies there. Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, that being. And on to the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. They settled to set up family. A lot of economic and businessmen came to this area. And agriculture and wheat. The culture had a lot, that's where the cities, using New York cities, and a lot of hard good industries. And then on to the southern colonies. They settled to set up large agricultural ones, plantations, tobacco, cotton, and rice. Culture, small towns served the whole plantation. You see the red states of Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia being those south colonies. So, okay, the population, it said here in 1750, grew to 2 million. Wow. And, okay, let's go on to the next. The methods of learning. So, the land was very abundant. And so it was ready to obtain, so they had many, many landholders. You could get land pretty cheap in America. And that's why a lot of people came economically, because in Europe you could not. It was difficult. Land was expensive. So in New England, the land was distributed by the local government. So in New England, they'd say, if you want some land, we can give you some land. Pay this or what, do this, you'll be able to get some land. And then, in fact, each settler was paid quitrent. It's called a quitrent. And that was their fixed annual fee to a proprietor. So you were giving that fixed annual, every year you had to pay this quitrent, you know, a tax or whatever, to be able to buy your land, which was pretty reasonable. In Virginia and in other colonies, they had what was called the headright system. What's the headright system? I kind of went over it already. It was a parcel was given to each settler who paid for an indentured servant to come. They wanted people to come to America so bad that they said, we will give you a parcel if you pay for indentured servants to come, more people to come. So sometimes it'd be like, okay, you get 50 people to come and we'll give you some land, right? That's what they did. So the headright system was basically, for each head that you brought to America, you would get land for. They were like, it was giveaway land. And this headright was copied in other colonies because the other colonies wanted people to come, settlers to come too, because the more settlers they had, the more prosperous the area would be. And of course, a lot of people weren't willing to do the harsh venture to America from Europe, you know, unless they were coming for either religious freedom or economic freedom, or I should say political freedom too. Well, anyway, plantations brought slave labor instead of indentured servants. There was a Dutch ship that came in, I think we went over that before, brought in slaves, and so now Africans came from Africa as slaves. Indentured servants were free to leave after 7 years, but African slaves would have to stay for their life as a slave. Slavery started in America, coming first from the Dutch ships. Transportation and communication was very slow and very difficult. A lot of times they would have to go on the waterways, navigate the waters, wherever there were like rivers, because rivers, you could get pretty quickly to another area if the river was a navigating river where you could put a ship on it and get there without going into rapids and stuff. And then they would also follow the Native American paths, through different areas, especially through like the Cumberland Gap and stuff. They were originally Native American paths to the west. Some deer paths, but mainly the natives had cleared these paths so they could get through. And then the pioneers started clearing trails for their wagons and stagecoaches. So because pioneers had wagons, of course, these trails had to be much bigger. And of course, their transportation a lot was by flatboat, because they had lots of supplies, and then they would have to go off the flatboat and go put them on the wagons and go on the trails. In 1750, the post roads connected large cities for mail carriers. They had to get their mail through, Pony Express and such, right? So they had to clear out some of these roads so that they could get messages and get their mail. That they didn't have the internet then. They couldn't get their mail. They needed to hear. They wanted to hear from not only Europe but from the other parts of America, and that would be by the postal carriers that would bring in the mail. The stagecoaches between the cities was very challenging. As you can see, it took a week to travel just from Boston to New York, which is not that far from Boston to New York. It took a whole week. Why? Because they had, when it was winter, they had to go through snow. And then they had this, deep dust sometimes and huge rocks and deep ruts and mud to go through. And so it was very hard to get through because they didn't have the roads that we have now, that's for sure. Industrial endeavors. They had abundant resources in America, and we still do, but they had these resources and wanted to use them. In New England, one of their greatest resources would be fishing, because they had fine harbors and waterfalls for power. In the middle country and the middle colonies, they had good waterways too, and great harbors, especially New York Harbor. And they also had furs. They traded furs with the traded for furs for the Indians and become wealthy. They had fisheries and minerals. And lumber in all of the colonies had good lumber. So they could make wood for furniture and houses out of wood and even start building ships. And so a lot of the colonies became great in shipbuilding, especially New England. The pine trees in Carolina and Georgia also provided for things like resin and pitch and turpentine. And the fishing and whaling industries in New England, because they needed that whale oil for fuel in their lamps back then. They didn't have electricity, so whaling was very profitable to them. But they mainly just wanted that whale blubber, that whale oil. Fur trading, as I went before, they bartered with the natives in pelts and hides, and that was profitable. Especially when I think of fur trading, we think of the French, but the English were fur traders too. The domestic system. Well, the entire family worked together. We know that. They had to work together. And so when they would weave cloth to make cloth for their family and to export or whatever they would, or to sell it, I should say, they would have their kids would work too, weaving that cloth. They would make flax and hemp rope. They needed to make rope, and making shoes and clothes and leathers. All of these, the whole family would work together, making their shoes, making leather, making furniture and tools that they needed in America. It was called the domestic system. Domestic means that the whole home would work together, domestically all working together. So it wasn't like it was an industry yet. It was basically families working together. The colonies' thriving commerce. Well, we have these triangular trade, if you see here. So the triangular trade routes came from New England to Africa. Yeah, Africa, they would bring slaves from Africa, right? But they also carried cargo there and cargo back, right? Because a ship without cargo would not make a lot of profit. So you can see right there by those triangles, like triangles here, but bringing in sugar and molasses and fruit this way, coming back up here with lumber, furs, fish, whale oil, gunpowder and stuff to England. And then the same down toward Africa, you have these different triangles of travel that they went. So these were the colonial exports and imports here. So the culture. Let's talk about the art. Well, art back then, they didn't have a camera, they didn't have photography, but they had to paint. So some of the great painters, one of them that's in your book is John Singleton Copley, and you see some of his paintings here, that one, and here's a picture of himself, his self-painting, and here's a picture of his family down here. So those were paintings. Well, he painted pictures of everyone, you know, because people they wanted their little girl picture. So they bring their little girl there, and he'd paint a picture of them. And those paintings are still around. So that's what he, and there were other artists that did, but most of the paintings were portraits back then. Because the pictures of the people's loved ones, they put in their, instead of having pictures of camera pictures like we have, you know, in albums, they would have portraits on the wall of their loved ones. And then the music, there was William Billings, he's up here in this corner. He was the first notable composer in America. And he basically put in choral music, you know, so he wrote many, many songs. And that's what they sing, you know, so he wrote a lot. The Lord is risen indeed, David's Lamentation, many other. A lot of his songs were very based in his faith in God, you know. So William Billings, remember him as a composer, and John Singleton Copley as a painter, portrait painter. Science. We have science. It was, you know, before in Europe, things were going on that weren't too good. They call it the Enlightenment period. It was the Endarkenment period, if you really know about it. But they departed from the traditional beliefs about God. In fact, they became a lot of atheists in the Enlightenment. And they rejected man's sin nature and said, man is basically good. We know now for sure that man is not basically good, huh? and they exalted humanism. They believed in humanism, nothing to do with God. So they started to go away from God, especially in France. But in America, most Americans that came believed in God. They had a faith. A lot of them came because of their faith, and they believed in the Bible. And so they studied science as a reflection of the Creator in America. Some of the scientists of America, of course, you're going to know this guy, Benjamin Franklin, right? 1706 to 1790. He's the best known scientist. And you know that. Why is he such a great known scientist? Well, because he's discovering of electricity with his kite flying, right? So he studied lightning and electricity. And then, of course, Cotton Mather down here. Cotton Mather lived earlier than Franklin, and he produced vaccine smallpox in America. And so he was definitely, known as for smallpox killed a lot of people, and so he helped cure that. So smallpox, especially Native American tribes. The home life. So what about home life? Well, they look at the buildings. They had when they first came, they had to have crude temporary buildings. They just said, hurry up and get the building up before winter came, right? Especially in Plymouth, right? So, but then the frontiersmen started building these elaborate log cabins, some very beautiful log cabins. And then the farmers started framing out houses, and the merchants started building pretty attractive homes that were copied off European homes. In New England, it started with small wood cottages with sloping thatched roofs, kind of like this down here, or like this here, I should say. And then on to the middle had a lot of Dutch, and the Dutch had this colorful brick, red brick, with steep roofs, kind of like here, I guess you could say, the Dutch look. And then in the South, they had these fine mansions with bricks and molded red clay. So these are the kind of homes that existed back in colonial times in the 16 and 1700s. Also, home life, and furniture, the middle colonies, we know, and we know that they grew tobacco, rice, grapes, indigo, and everything, or the southern colonies, I should say. And the middle colonies grew apples, wheat, corn. So they had a lot of farming and hunting in the middle colonies. And of course, New England was for fish, but here we have the pictures. Well, in their home life, they had to build furniture, so they made very practical homemade furniture. And the wealthy, they had this Rococo style from France of furniture, and they would have at least one fireplace. Yeah, everyone sat around the fireplace. It was the central place where the family gathered. Not the TV, but the fireplace, right? And they provided cooking, because the fireplace provided cooking and light and heat. So that's why they stayed there. They wanted light to read, and they wanted heat to be warm, and they wanted to eat, right? And so that's where all the family activity occurred, around the fireplace. So on the coast, like I said before, they would cook seafood. The frontiersmen would hunt wild game, and they ate deer a lot. And corn was the staple grain in America. And rice was more prominent in the South, because rice grew in a warmer climate. So that was their home life. Frontier life. Well, they wanted freedom and equal opportunity on the frontier, and the adventurous pushed west. They all started going westward to get into more land in the West. And in the West was a rugged life on the frontier. But settlers from all colonies mingled in different nationalities and such, and religious backgrounds. They all worked together on the frontier. And men were not judged by their social class, but by their accomplishments. That would be America. A little bit about Daniel Boone. I'm going to stop there, and we'll start with Daniel Boone in our next, because I'm getting kind of long. And then we'll go on to education, but we'll start with Daniel Boone.